Hello, dear listeners! Today, we embark on a captivating journey through the centuries, into the very heart of one of the longest and most fateful military campaigns in European history, an epic that spanned almost 8 centuries. This is a story of a fierce clash of civilizations, of selfless faith and bitter betrayal, of unimaginable heroism and chilling cruelty, of the birth of mighty nations and the crushing fall of once great empires. We speak of the Reconquista, the centuries-long, almost continuous struggle of the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula to reconquer lands seized by Muslim invaders. This grandiose epic, like a giant mosaic composed of the destinies of millions of people, left an indelible, profound mark on the culture, politics, and self-awareness of the peoples of Spain and Portugal, and in many ways determined the further, peculiar, and unpredictable course of world history. Prepare to immerse yourselves in a world of knights clad in steel and refined caliphs, holy warriors inspired by the heavens, and treacherous emirs weaving intrigues in their luxurious palaces. A world where the clang of swords often drowned out the words of prayer, and the fates of entire peoples were decided on blood-soaked battlefields. This is a tale of how, from the ashes of devastating defeats, from despair and humiliation, an indomitable will to victory was born, and how a colorful mosaic of disparate, feuding principalities gradually formed into mighty kingdoms, ready not just to survive, but to change the face of the known world. This is the Reconquista, the long road home. To fully understand the deep origins of the Reconquista, we must transport ourselves to the very beginning of the 8th century CE. The Iberian Peninsula, or Iberia as the ancient Greeks and Romans called it, was at that time under the rule of the Visigothic kingdom. Once formidable and powerful, this kingdom by the early 8th century was seriously weakened by protracted internal strife, fierce struggles for the royal throne in which noble families stooped to any means, and ever-increasing social inequality. The Visigothic aristocracy, once the pillar of the throne, was mired in endless intrigues and conspiracies, forgetting the interests of the state, while the common population suffered from chronic instability, the arbitrariness of magnates, and unbearable taxes. The state apparatus was riddled with corruption, and the army, though numerous, had lost its former discipline and fighting spirit. It was at this critical moment, when the Visigothic kingdom resembled a colossus on clay feet, that a new, rapidly expanding, and incredibly dynamic force appeared on the historical stage: the Arab Caliphate, whose domains already stretched from India to the Atlantic Ocean. In the year 711 CE, on an April day, a Muslim army crossed the narrow strait, later named Gibraltar, and landed on the southern shores of Iberia, near modern-day Tarifa. This army was commanded by the talented and brave Berber military leader Tariq ibn Ziyad, a loyal servant of the governor of North Africa, Musa ibn Nusayr. Legend has it that it was Tariq, pointing to the impregnable rock that would later bear his name, Jabal al-Tariq, or Tariq's Mountain, from which the modern name Gibraltar derives, who uttered the famous inspiring words, "O warriors, whither to flee? Behind us is the sea, before us the enemy. By Allah, you have nothing but truthfulness and patience." Tariq's army consisted mainly of Berbers, the indigenous inhabitants of North Africa, only recently converted to Islam. But these warriors were driven by both deep religious zeal and an indomitable thirst for glory and the rich booty promised by the fertile lands of Iberia. According to some accounts, Tariq's forces numbered about 7,000 men, according to others, up to 12,000, but it was a well-organized and battle-hardened army. The Visigothic king Roderick, the last ruler of the unified Visigothic kingdom, upon learning of the daring invasion, hastily assembled an army which, by various estimates, significantly outnumbered Tariq's forces, and marched to meet the invaders. The decisive battle, known in history as the Battle of Guadalete, took place in July of 711, supposedly on July 19th, on the banks of the river of the same name. Despite the possible numerical superiority of the Visigoths, Their army was utterly routed. A significant role in this was played not only by the military talent and decisiveness of Tariq ibn Ziyad, but also by the betrayal of a part of the Visigothic nobility, particularly the sons of the previous king Wititza, who were dissatisfied with Roderic's rule, and at a critical moment in the battle either defected to the Muslims or simply abandoned the field, weakening their army's ranks. King Roderick himself, it seems, perished in this fierce battle, although his body was never found, which gave rise to many legends. This crushing defeat was a true catastrophe for the Visigothic kingdom, its death agony. The path into the interior of the Iberian Peninsula was practically open for the Muslim conquerors. Over the next few years, from 711 to 718, Muslim troops, having received significant reinforcements under the command of Musa ibn Nusayr himself, the Arab governor of North Africa who arrived in Iberia in 712, rapidly advanced northward, capturing one major city after another. Córdoba, which would later become the jewel of Islamic Spain; Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital; Seville, Zaragoza, Mérida. By 718, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, except for a narrow, inaccessible strip of land in the far north, in the rugged mountains of Asturias, had fallen under Muslim rule. The conquered lands received the Arabic name Al-Andalus. The speed of this conquest is truly astonishing. In just 7 or 8 years, a vast kingdom fell to relatively few but resolute invaders. Several key factors contributed to this. The aforementioned internal weakness and political fragmentation of the Visigothic kingdom, the lack of unity among the nobility, the support given to the conquerors by part of the local population, including numerous and influential Jewish communities who had long suffered from oppression and discrimination by the Arian and later Catholic Visigothic kings, and the relatively lenient terms that the conquerors, at least initially, offered to subjugated cities. Christians and Jews, as people of the book, in Arabic, Ahl al-Kitab, were allowed to retain their faith, their places of worship, and their customs in exchange for paying a special poll tax, jizya, and a land tax, kharaj. This compared favorably with the policy of forced conversion to Arianism, and then to Catholicism, previously practiced by some Visigothic kings towards their subjects. Many cities surrendered without a fight, concluding treaties that guaranteed them the preservation of property and a certain autonomy. Thus began the centuries-long, almost 800-year history of Muslim presence on the Iberian Peninsula. Al-Andalus, as these lands came to be called, quickly transformed into one of the most prosperous, culturally developed, and densely populated parts of the entire Islamic world. Córdoba, which became the capital first of an emirate dependent on the Damascus Caliphate, and then, in the 10th century, of the powerful and independent Caliphate of Córdoba, rivaled such centers of world civilization as Baghdad and Constantinople in its splendor, wealth, and level of education. Sciences, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, botany, as well as art, architecture, poetry, and philosophy flourished there. Magnificent mosques, astounding in their sophistication, luxurious palaces with shady gardens and fountains, public baths, markets, and huge libraries were built. Muslim, as well as Jewish, scholars of Al-Andalus not only preserved, but also creatively developed the rich heritage of antiquity. The works of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen, which later, through Latin translations made in Toledo itself, would return to Christian Europe and play a crucial role in the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance. But not all inhabitants of Iberia reconciled themselves to the new order established by the conquerors. In the rugged, inaccessible mountains of Asturias, in the north of the peninsula, in the Cantabrian Mountains, where Muslim armies could not or did not wish to penetrate, a pocket of resistance emerged, destined to flare up into the flame of a centuries-long war for the recovery of lost lands. It is here, in this last bastion of Christianity, among the rocks and gorges, that the Reconquista, the long and difficult path of reconquest, begins. While Al-Andalus was experiencing its first golden age, In the north, in these inaccessible Cantabrian mountains, remnants of the defeated Visigothic nobility, surviving warriors, and simply freedom-loving Highlanders who refused to submit to foreign and infidel conquerors were gathering. The legendary, almost mythical figure of this early, desperate resistance was Pelagius, a Visigothic aristocrat, possibly, according to some traditions, a former bodyguard or squire of the last Visigothic king, Roderick. His origin is obscure, but his determination and charisma are beyond doubt. Around 718 CE, Pelagius was elected leader of the Asturians, these rebellious Highlanders. The first years of his rule were marked mainly by small guerrilla skirmishes, with Muslim detachments that occasionally raided the mountainous regions to collect tribute or pacify the recalcitrant. The turning point, traditionally considered the symbolic beginning of the Reconquista, was the Battle of Covadonga, which occurred, according to various estimates, between 718 and 722. Pelagius's small detachment, perhaps consisting of only a few hundred warriors, skillfully using their knowledge of the terrain and taking refuge in the narrow mountain gorge of Covadonga, offered desperate resistance to significantly superior Muslim forces sent to destroy him. Muslim chroniclers of the time describe this event as an insignificant skirmish with a handful of wild asses, not worth pursuing. However, for Christians, for those who had not lost heart, the Battle of Covadonga had immense moral significance, disproportionate to its scale. It became the first ray of hope, proof that resistance was possible, that the mighty conquerors could be defeated even by small forces if there was will and courage. This victory breathed life into the dying flame of struggle. After the victory at Covadonga, Pelagius founded the Kingdom of Asturias, with its capital initially in Cangas de Onís, a small settlement sheltered in the mountains. It was a tiny, poor, isolated state, cut off from the rest of the Christian world, constantly under threat of new Muslim raids. But it was this solid core, this spark, around which other Christian centers of resistance in the north of the Iberian Peninsula began to slowly but steadily form. Pelagius's successors, such as his son-in-law Alfonso III, nicknamed the Catholic, and his son Fruela I, nicknamed the Cruel, continued his difficult work, gradually expanding the territory of the young kingdom westward into Galicia and eastward into Cantabria. They actively used a scorched earth tactic in the Duero River Valley, creating a wide, devastated buffer zone between Christian and Muslim domains. This zone, known as the Desert of the Duero, for many years became a no-man's land, an arena of constant skirmishes and raids. Life in these borderlands was a constant, grueling struggle for survival, where every day could be the last. A crucial factor contributing to the strengthening and consolidation of the early Christian kingdoms was the emerging ideology. From the very beginning, the Reconquista acquired the characteristics of a holy war, a struggle for the true Christian faith against the infidel Hagarites, as Muslims were often called. The discovery in the early 9th century, presumably in 813 or 814, of the relics of Saint James the Greater, Zebedee's son, in Compostela, Galicia, had truly epical significance. The city of Santiago de Compostela, which grew around the Apostles' tomb, quickly became one of the three main pilgrimage centers in the entire Christian world, alongside Rome and Jerusalem. The cult of St. James as the heavenly patron of Spain, as Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer, a warrior fighting on a white horse at the head of Christian armies, inspired fighters, gave them strength and courage, and attracted numerous knights and pilgrims from all over Europe to the Iberian Peninsula, ready to fight for the faith. The Way of St. James became a road not only of pilgrimage, but also of cultural exchange and military reinforcement. By the 10th century, several Christian state formations had already clearly taken shape on the political map of northern Iberia, each with its own history and characteristics. Firstly, there was the Kingdom of Asturias, which later, after the capital was moved to the city of León in the early 10th century, became known as the Kingdom of León. It occupied the northwestern part of the peninsula and was considered the main heir to the Visigothic kingdom. Secondly, there was the Kingdom of Pamplona, later known as the Kingdom of Navarre, which arose in the Pyrenean Mountains, on lands inhabited by the ancient and freedom-loving Basque people. Navarre, sandwiched between the powerful Frankish state to the north and Muslim Al-Andalus to the south, often had to play a complex diplomatic game, maneuvering between its formidable neighbors. Thirdly, there was the County of Castile, which was initially an eastern border region, or march, of the Kingdom of León. The Castilians, living under constant military pressure on the border with Al-Andalus, were distinguished by particular belligerence, enterprise, and a strong desire for independence from the Leonese kings. The very name Castile comes from the Latin word castella, castles, as this land was literally dotted with numerous small fortresses and watchtowers protecting it from Muslim raids. And finally, fourthly, there were the Aragonese counties, such as Aragon proper, Sobrarbe, Ribagorza, and the Catalan counties, among which Barcelona stood out, as well as Girona, Urgell, and others. These counties arose in the eastern Pyrenees as part of the so-called Spanish March, created by Emperor Charlemagne in the late 8th to early 9th century to protect the Frankish kingdom from Muslim invasions from Iberia. Over time, these counties, especially Barcelona, gained de facto independence from the Frankish kings and began to pursue their own policies. Life in these early Christian kingdoms was incredibly harsh, full of dangers and hardships, constant wars, devastating raids from both sides, famine caused by crop failures and military actions, and frequent epidemics of various diseases were common, everyday occurrences. However, it was in these cruel conditions, in a continuous struggle for survival and for their faith, that the special, indomitable character of the Iberian Christians was forged. Steadfast, deeply religious, extremely warlike, and ready for self-sacrifice. Every peasant here was also a warrior, ready at any moment to exchange the plow for the sword and defend his land and family. A society was forming where military virtues were valued above all else. Meanwhile, while the flame of the Reconquista was slowly but surely igniting in the north of Iberia, Al-Andalus reached an unprecedented peak of its power and cultural flourishing. In 929, the Emir of Córdoba, Abd al-Rahman III, a member of the Umayyad dynasty, descendants of the caliphs overthrown in Damascus, proclaimed himself caliph and adopted the title al-Nasir li-Din Allah, meaning defender of God's faith. By this act, he not only declared his complete independence from the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad, but also challenged their claims to spiritual leadership in the entire Islamic world, as well as the Fatimids in North Africa. The period of the Caliphate of Córdoba, spanning the 10th and early 11th centuries, is rightly considered the golden age of Muslim Spain. Córdoba, the capital of the Caliphate, became one of the largest, richest, and most well-ordered cities in the world at that time. According to some estimates, its population reached 500,000 people or even more, comparable only to Constantinople and Baghdad. The city boasted hundreds of mosques, thousands of shops, numerous public baths, and paved streets with night lighting, an unheard-of luxury for contemporary Europe. The famous Mezquita, the Great Mosque of Córdoba, whose construction began in the 8th century, was significantly expanded and adorned, becoming one of the wonders of Islamic architecture. Its prayer hall, with a forest of over 850 columns of jasper, onyx, marble, and granite, amazed contemporaries. Not far from Córdoba, the caliph's suburban residence, Madinat al-Zahra, meaning City of Flowers, or Shining City, was built, a true palace city erected by Abd al-Rahman III, the construction of which lasted several decades and required colossal funds. Caliphs Abd al-Rahman III and his son and successor al-Hakam II, who reigned from 961 to 976, were not only strong and wise rulers, but also passionate patrons of sciences, arts, and literature. Outstanding scholars, physicians, mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, historians, and poets, both Muslim and Jewish, worked in Córdoba and other cities of Al-Andalus. Among them were the surgeon Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi, known in Europe as Albucasis, whose medical works were used in European universities for centuries, the astronomer and mathematician Maslama al-Majriti, and the philosopher Ibn Masara. The library of Caliph al-Hakam II in Córdoba, according to some accounts, contained up to 400,000 volumes, and according to others, even up to 600,000, making it one of the largest libraries in the world at that time. During this period, Al-Andalus significantly surpassed Christian Europe, then mired in the Dark Ages, in cultural, scientific, and economic development. Agriculture flourished, based on advanced irrigation technologies borrowed from the East, as did crafts, production of silk, brocade, leather goods, ceramics, weapons, jewelry, and trade with Mediterranean countries, North Africa, and even Byzantium and India. However, even at the peak of its splendor, the Caliphate of Córdoba was not entirely monolithic or devoid of internal problems. There were hidden and overt contradictions between different ethnic and social groups, between Arabs, who formed the ruling elite, Berbers, who constituted a significant part of the army and often felt deprived, and the Islamized indigenous population, the so-called Muwallids, who sometimes rebelled. The Christian kingdoms of the north, though significantly weaker than the Caliphate at the time, continued to pose a constant threat on the borders, conducting raids and gradually expanding their territories. The powerful military leader and de facto ruler of the Caliphate in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Abu Amir Muhammad ibn Abd Allah ibn Abi Amir, better known by his honorific title Al-Mansur, meaning the victorious by God's grace, undertook more than 50 successful military campaigns against the Christian states of the north. He ravaged their lands, burned cities, and took thousands of prisoners. In 997, he even captured and destroyed Santiago de Compostela, the main center of Christian pilgrimage, although according to tradition, he did not touch the relics of St. James themselves. But the bells of the cathedral were taken to Córdoba and melted down into lamps for the mezquita. These devastating campaigns by Al-Mansur temporarily halted the advance of the Reconquista, forcing the Christians into a defensive posture, but they could not break their spirit of resistance and will to fight. The death of the invincible Al-Mansur in 1002 and the subsequent fierce power struggle between his sons, Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar and Abd al-Rahman Sanchuelo, as well as other influential claimants from the aristocracy, led to a rapid weakening of central authority and the beginning of a protracted civil war in the Caliphate, known as the Fitna of Al-Andalus. In 1031, the Caliphate of Córdoba, torn by internal strife, finally disintegrated into numerous small independent emirates, known in history as taifas. There were more than 20, and sometimes up to 30 of them, including significant ones like Seville, Granada, Toledo, Zaragoza, Valencia, Badajoz, and Almeria. This period in the history of Al-Andalus, which lasted for most of the 11th century, is called the period of the taifas. The disintegration of the unified and powerful Caliphate of Córdoba into feuding emirates became a crucial turning point in the course of the Reconquista. Whereas previously the Christian kingdoms of the north, themselves often disunited, had faced a huge and centralized state, now they had to deal with scattered, weakened, and often warring petty principalities. This opened up completely new, previously unseen opportunities for the Christians to advance. The kings of León, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, as well as the counts of Barcelona, did not delay in exploiting this favorable situation. They began to actively intervene in the internal affairs of the taifas, supporting some emirs against others in their internecine wars, forming temporary alliances with them, and of course, steadily expanding their own domains at the expense of Muslim territories. An important source of income for Christian rulers, as well as a lever of political influence, became the so-called system of pariahs. This was tribute in gold and silver that many taifas were forced to pay to Christian kings for peace, non-aggression, or even military aid against their rival Muslim neighbors. These significant funds, coming from the south, were used to strengthen Christian armies, build castles, and further finance the offensive operations of the Reconquista. It was during this turbulent and contradictory period in the 11th century that one of the most brilliant, ambiguous, and legendary figures of the entire Reconquista appeared on the historical stage. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known by his Arabic nickname El Cid, meaning the Lord, and his Castilian nickname Campeador, meaning the warrior or the champion. A Castilian nobleman, an outstanding military commander, and an unsurpassed master of the sword, he first faithfully served King Sancho II of Castile, and then his brother and successor Alfonso VI. However, due to court intrigues and envy, El Cid was exiled from Castile by Alfonso VI. After his exile, he and his band of loyal warriors entered the service of the Emir of Zaragoza, one of the largest Muslim taifas, and successfully fought against other Muslim rulers as well as Christian neighbors, including the King of Aragon and the Count of Barcelona. Eventually, displaying miracles of bravery and military skill, El Cid, at the head of his own army, captured the rich and strategically important city of Valencia in 1094 and ruled it as an independent, de facto sovereign ruler until his death in 1099. His life, full of incredible adventures, knightly exploits, ups and downs, became fertile ground for numerous legends, romances, and, of course, the famous Castilian epic poem, The Song of My Cid, which immortalized his name, El Cid Campeador, who fought on both Christian and Muslim sides but always remained true to his principles, and deep down, his king, perfectly embodied the complex and contradictory spirit of that era. An era of warriors and fortune-seekers, loyal vassals and independent lords, where the lines between good and evil, us and them, were often quite blurred. The successes of the Christian kingdoms, especially the capture of Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital and one of the most important cultural and strategic centers of Al-Andalus, by King Alfonso VI of Castile in 1085, as well as the general weakening of the Muslim emirates, seriously alarmed the rulers of the taifas. Feeling that they could no longer cope alone with the growing military and political pressure from the north, they, after long hesitation and debate, reluctantly turned for help to a new powerful state that had arisen in North Africa, in the Maghreb, the Almoravid state. The Almoravids, or people of the Ribat, fortified monastery, were initially a military religious movement that originated among the Berber tribes of the Sahara. They preached a strict, ascetic, puritanical Islam based on a literal interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah, and sought to purify the faith from later accretions and luxury. By the mid-11th century, the Almoravids, under the leadership of their spiritual leaders and military commanders, had created a huge and warlike empire stretching from the Senegal River in the south to modern Algeria in the north, with its capital in Marrakesh. In 1086, responding to the desperate pleas of the emirs of Seville, Granada, and Badajoz, a huge Almoravid army under the personal command of their emir, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Iberia. On October 23, 1086, at the Battle of Sagrajas, or Zalaca, as the Spanish call it, the Almoravid army, reinforced by detachments from several taifas, inflicted a crushing, catastrophic defeat on the combined army of King Alfonso VI of Castile and his allies. The Christian army was virtually annihilated, and Alfonso VI himself barely escaped, suffering a severe wound. This battle long halted the victorious advance of the Reconquista and returned the initiative to the Muslims. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, seeing firsthand the weakness, disunity, and moral decay of the Andalusian Taifa rulers, who, in his opinion, indulged in luxury and forgot the true precepts of Islam, decided not to limit himself to providing them with military aid. In the following years, starting from 1090, he successively overthrew and expelled most of the Taifa emirs and annexed all of Al-Andalus to his vast North African empire. The relatively secular, tolerant, and culturally developed, though politically weak taifas were replaced by the harsher, more centralized, and religiously fanatical Almoravid regime. The period of Almoravid rule in Al-Andalus, which lasted until about the mid-12th century, was marked by a new temporary upsurge of Muslim power in Iberia. They reconquered some territories previously lost to the Christians, including Valencia, which was captured after the death of El Cid's widow Jimena in 1102. They also launched several successful campaigns against the Christian kingdoms. However, their power in Al-Andalus was not strong or long-lasting. The harsh asceticism and religious intolerance of the Almoravids provoked discontent and resistance from the local Andalusian population, both Muslim and Christian, Mozarabs, and Jewish, who were accustomed to a freer, more refined, and luxurious life. Moreover, the Almoravids themselves, who came from the desert, eventually began to lose their initial religious zeal and militancy, succumbing to the temptations of sophisticated Andalusian culture and becoming mired in internal intrigues and power struggles. By the mid-12th century, the Almoravid state, weakened by internal strife and rebellions in Al-Andalus, as well as in North Africa, came under attack from a new, even more powerful and radical Berber religious political movement, the Almohads. The Almohads, meaning those who affirm the unity of God in Arabic, were also religious reformers, but their doctrine, based on the teachings of Imam Ibn Tumart, was even stricter, more puritanical, and intolerant of dissent than that of the Almoravids. They considered the Almoravids apostates from the true faith, accusing them of polytheism and anthropomorphism. By 1172, the Almohads, under the leadership of their caliphs from the Abd al-Mu'min dynasty, had established full control over all of Al-Andalus, overthrowing the last Almoravid rulers and their allies. They created an even more powerful and centralized empire than their predecessors, with its capital in Marrakesh in Morocco and a second capital in Seville in Al-Andalus. The Almohads launched new decisive and large-scale offensives against the Christian kingdoms of the north, seeking to reclaim all lands previously lost by the Muslims. In 1195, at the Battle of Alarcos, in Castilian territory, the army of the Almohad Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur, nicknamed the Victorious, inflicted a most severe, crushing defeat on King Alfonso VIII of Castile. Castilian losses were enormous. Many noble knights perished or were captured. It seemed that the Reconquista was once again set back for decades, if not centuries, and that Muslim rule in Iberia had received a new, powerful impetus. The invasions of the Almoravids, and then the Almohads, these two waves of Berber conquerors from North Africa, had a very dual and contradictory significance for the further course of the Reconquista. On the one hand, they undoubtedly led to a temporary but significant strengthening of Muslim military power on the Iberian Peninsula and inflicted a series of very heavy and painful defeats on Christian armies. They slowed down, and at times even reversed, the process of reconquering lands. On the other hand, these invasions, paradoxically, contributed to greater consolidation and cohesion among the Christian kingdoms in the face of a common, mortal threat. The ideology of a holy war, a crusade against the Moors, as Christians collectively called all Muslims of Iberia, received a new, powerful impetus and widespread dissemination. Furthermore, the extremely harsh and intolerant religious policy of the Almoravids, and even more so of the Almohads, towards the non-Muslim population, Mozarab Christians living in Muslim territories, and numerous Jewish communities, led to their mass persecution, forced conversion to Islam, or flight to the north into Christian kingdoms. This, in turn, strengthened the demographic, economic, and intellectual potential of the Christian states that received these refugees. The crushing defeat at Alarcos in 1195 was a bitter but sobering lesson for the Christian rulers of Iberia, primarily for King Alfonso VIII of Castile. It became absolutely clear that only through the united, coordinated efforts of all Christian forces on the peninsula could they withstand the colossal military might of the Almohad Empire. King Alfonso VIII of Castile, the main victim and humiliated party at Alarcos, made truly titanic diplomatic efforts to create a broad pan-Christian coalition. He appealed for help and support to Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful and influential pontiffs of the Middle Ages. Pope Innocent III, deeply concerned by the Almohad successes and the threat to Christianity in Spain, responded to the call and declared a crusade in Spain, urging knights and warriors from all over Europe to join the holy struggle against the infidels and promising participants in the campaign remission of sins. Other Christian monarchs of the Iberian Peninsula responded to the Pope's and King Alfonso's call. King Peter II of Aragon, nicknamed the Catholic, and King Sancho VII of Navarre, nicknamed the Strong for his tall stature and physical might. King Afonso II of Portugal, though not participating personally, also sent a significant military contingent. In addition, numerous detachments of knights arrived in Iberia from France, especially from its southern regions, as well as from Italy and other European countries. A crucial role in the upcoming battle was also to be played by representatives of the military religious orders, hardened in battles with Muslims. The orders of Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara, Montesa, as well as the international orders of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller. These orders, combining a strict monastic lifestyle with constant military service, played an increasingly significant role in the Reconquista, holding numerous castles and fortresses on the dangerous frontier, and forming the elite, the strike force of Christian armies. The Almohad Caliph, Muhammad al-Nasir, son of the victor of Alarcos, Yaqub al-Mansur, in turn, assembled a huge army, according to some estimates truly countless, which included warriors from all corners of his vast empire, from the Maghreb, from Al-Andalus, as well as mercenaries. Medieval chroniclers cite figures from 100,000 to 600,000 warriors, although modern historians consider them highly exaggerated. Nevertheless, the Almohad army undoubtedly significantly outnumbered the forces of the Christian coalition. With this armada, Caliph al-Nasir marched north, intending to definitively crush Christian resistance and restore full Islamic dominion over the Iberian Peninsula. The decisive battle, one of the most famous and significant in medieval history, took place on July 16, 1212, on the wide plain of Las Navas de Tolosa, located in the foothills of the Sierra Morena, in southern Castile. The battle was incredibly fierce, stubborn, and bloody. Its outcome hung in the balance for many hours. Initially, the significant numerical superiority and ferocious attacks of the light Berber cavalry and the Caliph's fanatical guard, consisting of black slaves, were on the side of the Almohads. Their powerful blows nearly broke through the center of the Christian army, where King Alfonso VIII himself stood with his Castilians. However, the incredible resilience and courage of the Castilian knights and infantry, a timely flank attack by the Navarrese cavalry under the personal command of the elderly but still mighty King Sancho VII, the Strong, who, according to a famous legend, personally cut through the chains surrounding the caliph's tent, guarded by his bodyguards with his sword, and a decisive and coordinated counterattack by all Christian forces, including reserves, ultimately decided the outcome of this grandiose battle. The Almohad army was utterly routed, suffered monstrous losses, and was put to panicked flight. Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir himself barely escaped, fleeing the battlefield with a small detachment of bodyguards. The booty captured by the Christians was enormous. The victory at Las Navas de Tolosa had colossal, truly epoch-making significance. It became the greatest triumph of Christian arms in the entire centuries-long history of the Reconquista, and marked an irreversible, decisive turning point in the course of the entire war. The hitherto invincible military might of the Almohad Empire was definitively broken, and their prestige in the Islamic world collapsed. Soon after this crushing defeat, the Almohad Empire began to rapidly disintegrate under the weight of internal turmoil and rebellions. The path into the very heart of Muslim Spain, into fertile and rich Andalusia, was now open for Christian armies. Muslim hopes of restoring full control over Iberia were buried on the plain of Las Navas de Tolosa. In the following decades, from approximately 1212 to 1260, the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, capitalizing on the fruits of this great victory and the weakness of the disintegrating Almohad state, began a rapid, virtually unstoppable offensive to the south. The Kingdom of Castile and León, definitively united into a single state in 1230, under King Ferdinand III, nicknamed the Saint, played a key, leading role in the conquest of most of Andalusia. Ferdinand III, an outstanding ruler and commander, nicknamed King of the Three Religions by his contemporaries for his relative tolerance towards conquered Muslims and Jews, yet who steadfastly and consistently pursued the policy of Reconquista, captured the most important cities and centers of Al-Andalus. In 1236, Córdoba, the former brilliant capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, fell, its great mosque converted into a cathedral. Then, after stubborn sieges, Murcia was taken in 1243, Jaén in 1246, and finally, in 1248, after a 15-month siege, Seville, the main Almohad city in Iberia, and one of the largest and richest cities on the peninsula, surrendered. His son and successor, Alfonso X, nicknamed the Wise for his learning and patronage of sciences and arts, continued his father's work, taking Cadiz in 1262 and definitively establishing Castilian dominion in Lower Andalusia. The Kingdom of Aragon, under the energetic and wise rule of King James IV, nicknamed the Conqueror, focused its main efforts eastward, along the Mediterranean coast. In several sea and land campaigns lasting from 1229 to 1235, James IV conquered the Balearic Islands, Majorca, Minorca, and Ibiza, which were important pirate bases and commercial centers. Then, after a long and difficult war from 1232 to 1238, he conquered the rich and fertile Muslim kingdom of Valencia, which fell after the capture of its namesake capital. Thus, the Kingdom of Aragon gained wide access to the Mediterranean Sea, transforming into a major maritime and commercial power whose interests would soon extend to Sicily, Sardinia, and even Greece. The Kingdom of Portugal, located in the west of the peninsula, completed its Reconquista earlier than other Iberian states. Portuguese kings, starting with Afonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, consistently advanced southward. King Afonso III, in 1249, after taking the city of Faro, definitively established control over the southernmost region of the country, the Algarve, meaning the West in Arabic. From that moment, Portugal's borders, with minor exceptions, remained virtually unchanged throughout its subsequent history, making it one of Europe's oldest nation-states with fixed borders. By the mid-13th century, just some 50 years after the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, the overwhelming majority of the Iberian Peninsula was under the rule of Christian kings. The Muslim presence, once occupying almost all of Iberia, had shrunk to the small, though still rich, emirate of Granada, located in the far south in mountainous terrain around the city of Granada. This emirate, ruled by the Nasrid dynasty, was forced to recognize itself as a vassal of Castile and pay it a significant annual tribute. The conquest of vast, previously densely populated Muslim territories presented new, complex, and large-scale challenges for Christian rulers. Primarily the task of resettling depopulated or abandoned lands, the repoblación, then organizing effective governance in the newly annexed territories, and finally integrating or assimilating the remaining Muslim population, known as mudejar, and numerous Jewish communities. The policy of Christian authorities towards conquered Muslims and Jews varied significantly depending on time, place, and specific circumstances. In some cases, especially in the early stages and where resistance was minimal, Muslims and Jews were allowed to remain on their lands, retain their faith, language, customs, and even a certain degree of self-government within their communities, aljamas, but under the supreme authority of Christian lords, and of course, with the obligatory payment of taxes. In other cases, especially after Muslim rebellions or in strategically important areas, they were expelled from conquered lands or forcibly resettled elsewhere. Mosques were very often, almost universally, rebuilt or simply converted into Christian churches. The rich cultural heritage of Al-Andalus, its architecture, science, literature, crafts, was partially assimilated and adapted by the victors, but a significant part, unfortunately, was irretrievably lost, destroyed, or deliberately consigned to oblivion. The Reconquista in the 13th century, especially after Las Navas de Tolosa, acquired a distinctly, almost officially, crusading character. The idea of a holy war, blessed by the Pope, approved by the entire Christian world, inspired warriors, attracted volunteers from other European countries, and served as a powerful ideological justification for conquests and expansion. However, it should not be forgotten that the Reconquista was not only, and not so much, a religious war, but a complex interweaving of various motives. It was also a struggle for fertile lands, for pastures, for control over trade routes, for political power, for wealth, and for social prestige. Religious fervor often went hand in hand with very earthly interests. After the turbulent and rapid events of the 13th century, when most of Al-Andalus came under Christian control, the overall pace of the Reconquista noticeably slowed. The Emirate of Granada, the last remnant of once mighty Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula, proved surprisingly resilient and survived for almost another 2.5 centuries, from the mid-13th to the late 15th century. Several important factors contributed to this. Firstly, its advantageous geographical position. Granada was located in the inaccessible mountainous terrain of the Sierra Nevada, which significantly hampered large-scale military operations for Castilian armies and facilitated defense. Secondly, the skillful and flexible diplomacy of the Nasrid emirs of Granada. They masterfully maneuvered between their powerful neighbors, Castile to the north and the Muslim states of North Africa, particularly the Marinid Sultanate in Morocco, to the south. The Granadan emirs generally paid regular tribute to Castile, acknowledging its suzerainty, but at the same time occasionally sought military aid from their African co-religionists when pressure from Castile became too strong. Thirdly, internal problems and conflicts periodically shook the Christian kingdoms themselves, primarily Castile. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Castile and Aragon repeatedly experienced prolonged periods of dynastic crises, fierce civil wars between various feudal factions, as well as devastating epidemics, the most terrible of which was the Black Death, the mid-14th century plague pandemic that claimed the lives of a third of Europe's population. All these internal troubles diverted the strength and resources of Christian monarchs from a consistent fight against the Emirate of Granada. And fourthly, the certain economic importance of the Emirate of Granada cannot be discounted. Granada was an important center for the production of high-quality silk, exquisite ceramics, embossed leather goods, weapons, and other crafts, as well as a center for transit trade between North Africa and Europe. Trade with Granada brought certain income to both the emirs themselves and their Christian neighbors, especially Genoese and Catalan merchants, which sometimes made maintaining the status quo beneficial for certain influential circles. Despite all these factors contributing to the survival of the Emirate of Granada, the overall pressure on it from Castile, though uneven, gradually and steadily increased throughout this period. Frequent border skirmishes and mutual raids occurred, and the Castilians gradually reconquered individual border fortresses and towns. There were also major, bloody battles, such as the famous Battle of Rio Salado in 1340, where combined Castilian-Portuguese forces under King Alfonso X of Castile and Afonso IV of Portugal inflicted a crushing defeat on a huge Granadan Marinid army that had invaded Andalusia. This victory definitively undermined Marinid attempts to actively intervene in Iberian affairs. The key event that ultimately predetermined the fall of the Emirate of Granada and the end of the entire centuries-long Reconquista was the dynastic marriage of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, concluded in 1469. Although Castile and Aragon formally remained separate kingdoms with their own laws, courts, parliaments, cortes, and administrative institutions, their unification under the joint rule of the Catholic monarchs. This honorary title was bestowed upon them by Pope Alexander II in 1496 for their zealous defense of the Catholic faith, created a powerful, centralized state capable of mobilizing all necessary human and material resources to deliver a decisive blow to the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon were extremely ambitious, energetic, and purposeful rulers. They consistently strove to strengthen royal power, suppress the liberties of rebellious nobility, centralize state administration, and establish the Catholic faith as the sole, unifying religion throughout their domains. The completion of the Reconquista, meaning the complete expulsion of Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, became for them one of the main political, ideological, and even personal tasks, a symbol of their power and piety. The final war with the Emirate of Granada, known as the Granada War, began in 1482 and lasted a full 10 years, until early 1492. It was a hard, exhausting, and costly war, requiring an immense exertion of all forces and resources from Castile and Aragon. Christian troops, for the first time in the history of the Reconquista, widely and effectively using siege artillery that shattered the walls of ancient Moorish fortresses, gradually, step by step, captured one fortress after another, one city after another, methodically tightening the ring of encirclement around the Emirate's capital, the magnificent city of Granada, located at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Within the Emirate of Granada itself, fierce dynastic strife and civil war raged at this critical time. The last emir of Granada, Abu Abdallah Muhammad II, better known in European chronicles by the distorted name Boabdil, waged an exhausting power struggle first with his father, Emir Abul Hassan Ali, and then with his uncle, Muhammad ibn Sa'd, known as Al-Zagal, the Valiant. These internal conflicts, betrayals, and mutual accusations catastrophically weakened the Muslims' ability to offer organized resistance and significantly facilitated the task of the Catholic monarchs. Boabdil was captured by the Castilians several times and forced to conclude humiliating treaties with them, which further undermined his authority among his subjects. By the end of 1491, the situation of Granada, besieged by a huge Christian army, had become absolutely hopeless. The city was tightly surrounded, all food supply routes were cut off, famine and disease began, and hopes for help from North Africa did not materialize. After long and agonizing negotiations, Emir Boabdil agreed to surrender the city on relatively honorable terms, which guaranteed the Muslim population the preservation of life, property, faith, and customs. On January 2, 1492, on a cold winter day, the Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand, accompanied by their retinue and jubilant army, solemnly entered conquered Granada. Legend has it that Boabdil, leaving his native city forever and heading into exile, turned to look one last time at the magnificent Alhambra, towering over Granada, and wept bitterly. His stern mother, Aisha al-Hora, supposedly said to him then the famous words, "You do well, my son, to weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." The place from which he, according to tradition, cast his last glance at Granada is still called El Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's last sigh. The fall of Granada marked the long-awaited and triumphant end of the almost 8th-century epic of the Reconquista. The entire Iberian Peninsula, with the exception of the independent Kingdom of Portugal, came under the unified rule of Christian monarchs. This grandiose event had enormous symbolic and practical significance for both Spain itself and the entire Christian world of that time. It was seen as the greatest triumph of Christianity over Islam, as the restoration of historical justice, as the fulfillment of divine providence. The completion of the Reconquista raised the prestige of the Catholic monarchs to unprecedented heights and opened new, exciting horizons for Spain. The completion of the Reconquista, in the momentous year of 1492, was not just the end of one era, but also the starting point for a new, even more grandiose era in the history of Spain, and, without exaggeration, the entire world. This year generally proved to be incredibly saturated with fateful events for Spain, a kind of bifurcation point that determined its future for centuries to come. Firstly, of course, was the fall of Granada itself, and the final end of centuries-long Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. Secondly, just a few months after the capture of Granada, in March of 1492, the Catholic monarchs issued the infamous Alhambra Decree, or Edict of Expulsion. This decree ordered all Jews living in the territories of Castile and Aragon to either convert to Christianity within 4 months or leave the country forever, under penalty of death and confiscation of property. This cruel act led to the mass, tragic expulsion of tens, and according to some estimates, hundreds of thousands of Jews, known as Sephardim. Many of them were highly educated people, talented artisans, experienced merchants, physicians, and financiers. Their expulsion dealt a serious, though not immediately noticeable, blow to Spain's economy and cultural development, but it did contribute to the appearance of religious unity. And thirdly, in the autumn of that same year, 1492, after long hesitation and doubt, the first transatlantic expedition of the Genoese navigator Christopher Columbus, generously financed by Queen Isabella of Castile, who, according to legend, pawned her jewels for this purpose, reached the shores of the New World, leading to the discovery of America for Europeans. It is no coincidence that Spain, hardened in the crucible of the centuries-long Reconquista, possessing vast experience in developing and settling new lands, overflowing with religious zeal and missionary spirit, and having a surplus of enterprising and warlike hidalgos left without occupation after the end of the war with the Moors, became the pioneer of the great geographical discoveries, and in the following decades created a vast colonial empire spanning several continents, over which the sun never set. The spirit of the Reconquista, the spirit of conquest, crusade, spreading the Catholic faith, and the tireless search for glory and untold riches, was fully transferred by Spanish conquistadors to the expanses of the newly discovered New World. The legacy of the Reconquista, this long and complex historical process, was extremely multifaceted, profound, and in many ways contradictory. It is still felt in Spain and Portugal today. Firstly, it led to the formation of the Spanish and Portuguese nations and their national consciousness. The centuries-long, exhausting struggle against a common enemy, the Moors, contributed to erasing regional differences, uniting various ethnic groups, and forming a sense of unity and common historical destiny. The Catholic religion became the most important cornerstone element of national identity, the basis of cultural and political unity. Secondly, it resulted in the centralization of state power and the creation of strong absolutist monarchies. The need to wage constant, large-scale wars and mobilize all the country's resources required the concentration of power and financial means in the hands of the kings. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, skillfully using the outcomes of the Reconquista, laid solid foundations for a centralized, bureaucratic, and largely absolutist state in Spain, subjugating rebellious nobility and cities to their will. Thirdly, it provided colossal military experience and inexhaustible expansionist energy. During the Reconquista, the Spanish and Portuguese gained vast, unique experience in waging wars under various conditions, and in developing and colonizing new territories. This experience, these skills, as well as a warlike spirit, were successfully applied by them in conquering and developing vast colonial possessions in America, Africa, and Asia. The conquistadors of the New World such as Hernán Cortés or Francisco Pizarro, were in many ways direct successors of the knights and warriors of the Reconquista. Fourthly, unfortunately, it also led to the establishment of religious intolerance and persecution of dissenters. The passionate desire of the Catholic monarchs and their successors to achieve complete religious unity in the country led to cruel persecutions and ultimately to the expulsion first of the Jews in 1492, and then in the early 17th century, between 1609 and 1614, of the Muslim Moriscos, descendants of baptized Moors, who were constantly suspected of secretly practicing Islam and disloyalty to the crown. The Spanish Inquisition, established back in 1478 to combat heresies and control the purity of faith, especially among new converts, became a powerful and terrible instrument of repression, suppressing any dissent and controlling all spheres of public and private life. The price for the achieved religious and political unity was extremely high. Spain lost many of its talented and hard-working sons and daughters. Fifthly, it had a complex and ambiguous cultural influence. Despite constant wars and deep religious antagonisms, over the centuries there was also a certain cultural interaction, interpenetration, and even synthesis between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures on the Iberian Peninsula. The Arabic language left a noticeable mark on Spanish and Portuguese, especially in vocabulary related to science, agriculture, crafts, and daily life. Many elements of Arab architecture, such as arches, domes, ornaments, use of ceramic tiles, as well as achievements in agricultural technology, irrigation, medicine, and mathematics, were borrowed and adapted by Christians. However, as already noted, much of the richest and most refined cultural heritage of Al-Andalus was irretrievably lost, deliberately destroyed, or simply forgotten in the heat of religious struggle and subsequent unification. And finally, sixthly, it shaped certain economic and social characteristics. The system of repoblación, meaning the resettlement of lands reconquered from Muslims by Christian settlers, led to the formation of a specific land ownership structure, especially in southern Spain, in Andalusia, where vast landed estates, latifundia, belonging to the nobility, the church, and military knightly orders predominated. The military aristocracy and the Catholic Church, which played a key role in the Reconquista, received huge land grants, wealth, and numerous privileges, which for a long time determined the social structure of Spanish society. The Reconquista is not just a long series of bloody wars and sieges. It is a complex, multifaceted, and contradictory historical process that radically determined the historical destiny of the entire Iberian Peninsula and had an enormous, far-reaching influence on all of European and even world history. It left behind a rich and diverse legacy, from majestic, impregnable castles and magnificent cathedrals, often built on the foundations of former mosques, to a unique, distinctive culture in which European and Eastern influences, Christian and Muslim motifs, are bizarrely intertwined. Today, many centuries later, the Reconquista remains a crucial, integral part of the historical memory and national consciousness of the peoples of Spain and Portugal. It continues to be a subject of legitimate national pride, a symbol of resilience and revival, but also an object of increasingly active scholarly debate, critical analysis, and profound reinterpretation in light of modern knowledge and values. Traditionally, for centuries, the Reconquista was viewed primarily as a heroic, just, and sacred struggle for the liberation of native land from foreign invaders and for the restoration of the true Christian faith. This patriotic and religious narrative was actively shaped and supported by royal authority, the church, chroniclers, and writers. It played an extremely important role in the process of consolidating the Spanish nation, especially during periods of external threats or internal crises. Monuments to the heroes of the Reconquista, such as the legendary Pelagius, the brave El Cid Campeador, the pious Ferdinand III the Saint, or the powerful Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand, still adorn the squares and streets of many Spanish cities, reminiscent of a glorious past. However, modern historians, relying on news sources and methodological approaches, offer a more complex, multidimensional, and nuanced view of these distant events. They pay particular attention to the following aspects, previously often ignored or underestimated. For example, the heterogeneity and contradictory nature of the participants in the Reconquista themselves. It was not a monolithic, unified movement. The Christian kingdoms of the north, León, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, Portugal, very often and fiercely fought not only against Muslims, but also among themselves, disputing territories, influence, and leadership. Moreover, temporary tactical alliances between Christian and Muslim rulers, directed against their own co-religionists, were by no means rare in that turbulent era. It is also emphasized that at the beginning of the Reconquista, in the 8th to 10th centuries, there was no single Spain in the modern political or national sense of the word. The Iberian Peninsula was a colorful patchwork of various, often warring kingdoms, counties, and emirates, each pursuing its own, often narrowly selfish interests. The idea of a unified Spain, united under a Christian crown, formed very slowly, gradually, over many centuries, and the Reconquista itself was one of the main factors in this process. More attention is also paid to the so-called convivencia, meaning coexistence. Alongside continuous military conflicts, looting, and violence, there were also quite long periods of relatively peaceful coexistence, active cultural exchange, and fruitful mutual influence between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities, especially in major urban centers like Toledo, Córdoba, Seville, and Zaragoza. Although one should certainly not idealize this convivencia by presenting it as some golden age of tolerance, as it was always hierarchical and unequal, it was nevertheless an important and integral part of the complex reality of medieval Iberia. The motives of the Reconquista participants are also being re-examined. The religious factor, the idea of a holy war, undoubtedly played an enormous, sometimes decisive role, especially in mobilizing the masses and legitimizing power. But it was far from always the only or even the main one. The thirst for fertile lands and pastures, the desire to seize rich booty, the aspiration for political power, fame, social status, all these very earthly, pragmatic motives were also powerful incentives for participants in the Reconquista on both sides of the conflict. And of course, modern researchers pay much more attention to the tragic fate of religious and ethnic minorities. The Muslim population, Mudéjars, and later Moriscos, and numerous Jewish communities, after the formal completion of the Reconquista, emphasizing the cruel aspects of their forced assimilation, persecution, and ultimately mass expulsions, which had long-term negative consequences for Spain itself. Disputes and discussions about the Reconquista, its character, significance, and consequences continue to this day, and they often extend beyond purely academic circles, reflecting contemporary political, ideological, and cultural debates about national identity, the role of religion in society, the problems of multiculturalism, and relations between the West and the Islamic world. Some see the Reconquista as a historical prototype of an eternal clash of civilizations. Others, as a complex and multifaceted example of interaction, conflict, and mutual enrichment of different cultures in one territory. One thing is certain. The Reconquista is an absolutely key, pivotal event in the history not only of the Iberian Peninsula, but of all Europe. Without a deep understanding of this long and complex process, it is impossible to fully comprehend either the rich and contradictory past or the multifaceted present of Spain and Portugal, nor many of the fundamental processes that shaped the modern world as we know it. It is a grandiose epic that even today, centuries later, continues to stir the minds of historians and ordinary people, provoke sharp debates, inspire artists and writers to create new works, and encourage scholars to new research and discoveries. 8 centuries. Just imagine, almost 800 long, agonizing years of blood and iron, faith and despair, decided the fate of the beautiful Iberian Peninsula. The Reconquista was incredibly long, exhausting, at times unbearably cruel and bloody. But it became the harsh historical crucible in which two distinctive European nations were forged, their state borders defined, their unique national character formed, and a new, previously unknown energy was born, allowing them soon to step far beyond the limits of the then-known world, towards new continents and oceans. This is an eternal story of the unbroken resilience of the human spirit, of the all-conquering power of faith, of the high and sometimes tragic price of unity, and of the inevitable but often fruitful clash of worlds that forever changed not only the map of Europe, but also presaged an entire era of great geographical discoveries and global changes. The memory of the Reconquista lives on today in the silent stone of ancient stern fortresses and majestic cathedrals, in the resonant names of cities, rivers, and mountains, in the poignant melodies of old folk songs and romances, and, of course, in the hearts and minds of millions of descendants of those who once lived, loved, suffered, and fought on this blessed and long-suffering land. It serves as an eternal reminder to us that history is not a frozen picture of the distant past, covered in the dust of ages, but a continuous, living, and always relevant dialogue between bygone and present eras, between different cultures and generations, a dialogue that helps us better understand ourselves and our place in this vast, constantly changing world. Thank you very much for being with us on this long and, I hope, fascinating journey through the intricate and dramatic pages of distant history. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new, equally captivating stories about the past. Until new interesting meetings.